Good morning. At the DOGE subcommittee, we are continuing our war on waste. That means rooting out spending that is unnecessary, wasteful, and frankly, un-American. Today, we are looking at the more than $500 million federal taxpayers spend annually to fund public radio and television. A big chunk of this subsidy flows to National Public Radio and Public Broadcasting Service. NPR and PBS are the big DC-based entities that create and distribute much of the news and educational content heard and seen on public radio and TV stations across the country. When Congress adopted the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, it did so because it thought at the time that federal dollars were needed to provide objective news and education content to the entire nation, including rural residents who lived off the grid. Fast forward a few decades, and a lot has changed. The invention of the internet, for instance, and social media. It's made news and information widely available to those living in remote areas. Americans are increasingly consuming digital media and podcasts. The audience of public radio and television is declining. And I know this because I represent a rural district where farmers listen to podcasts and internet-based news while they drive their tractors. At the same time, NPR and PBS have increasingly become radical left-wing echo chambers for a narrow audience of mostly wealthy, white, urban liberals and progressives who generally look down on and judge rural America. PBS News is not just left-leaning, but it is actively uses taxpayer funds to push some of the most radical left positions, like featuring a drag queen on the show Let's Learn, a show targeted toward young children ages 3 to 8 years old. I want you to know I grew up watching children's programming on PBS. And as a mother who raised 3 children, I felt confident that I could leave the room while my own children were watching children's programming on PBS. But I can tell you right now, Ms. Kruger, specifically, as a mother, if I had walked in my living room or one of my children's bedrooms and seen this child predator and this monster targeting my children, I would become unglued. And that is how most parents feel all over this country. This is not the only example of them sexualizing and grooming children. They've been doing it for over the last decade. In 2015, PBS produced Frontline, put out a documentary, Growing Up Trans, that takes viewers on an intimate and eye-opening journey inside the struggles and choices facing transgender kids and their families. This means that PBS is one of the founders of the trans child abuse industry, all while taking taxpayer money. Brainwashing and transing children is an issue so hated by parents across the country that it was a driving force in the landslide Republican and Trump victory in the 2024 election cycle and presidential race. The news that these entities produced is either resented or increasingly tuned out and turned off by most of the hardworking Americans who are forced to pay for it. They no longer view NPR and PBS as trusted news sources. As a matter of fact, with these people, they're a threat. In fact, when Elon Musk put his hand over his heart and extended it and told the American people his heart goes out to them, PBS News posted the clip, called it a fascist Nazi salute, and described how it was similar to the same Heil used by Nazis at their victory rallies. Not once did PBS or NPR report on the numerous accounts of Democrats making the same gesture. AOC, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Elizabeth Warren, somebody that lost a presidential race, Hillary Clinton, Governor Tim Walz. Why wasn't this treated exactly the same way? Is there not a standard in journalism today? Apparently not. Here's How We Lost America's Trust was in fact the title of a powerful essay written last year by Yuri Berliner, a veteran NPR editor. In his essay, Berliner described how NPR's downward spiral accelerated greatly during the first Trump administration. He said NPR dedicated efforts to damage the Trump presidency via relentless pursuit of Russiagate rumors that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia over the election. NPR hosts interviewed Adam Schiff, then the top Democrat of the House Intelligence Committee, 25 times about Trump and Russia. But they made no apologies when the Mueller report found no evidence that the Trump campaign had colluded with Russia, because they did not. Berliner also described NPR's passionate embrace of the left-wing DEI ideology that Americans clearly reject, as evidenced by the November elections. NPR's language and style guides were shaped by race and gender-based affinity groups that dominated the internal culture of the organization. And NPR journalists were to ask everyone they interviewed their race, gender, and ethnicity, and enter it into a centralized tracking system. This tracking system embeds DEI into the fibers of its content. Sounds like racism to me. It's a software attached to NPR's content management system where these reporters and producers submit information about their sources' race and ethnicity, gender identity, geographic location, that's kind of scary, and age range. The tool allows NPR to track the demographics of their sources in real time to allow for source diversity. The irony of these supposed diverse sources is that NPR has no real interest in diversity, like having diverse viewpoints. Berliner tried to sound the alarm on this when he checked voter registration records of the editors at DC's NPR headquarters and found 87 registered Democrats and 0 registered Republicans. But NPR treated Berliner like a political dissident in the old Soviet Union. He was driven out of the organization and forced to resign. Sounds like communism. And the ringleader of that effort was NPR's then newly appointed CEO, Catherine Marr, who is before us today. She dismissed Mr. Berliner's wake-up call as profoundly disrespectful, hurtful, and demeaning. In other words, instead of viewing it as a chance to finally right the ship at NPR, she doubled down. In doing so, she made it clear how any further internal dissent would be dealt with on her watch. That does sound like communist China at the taxpayer's expense. And no one should be surprised. NPR installed her in the top job after Ms. Marr was firmly on record with a litany of public comments and social media posts displaying her ultra-progressive views, her scorn for free speech, and her fondness for censorship. So now it's up to Congress to determine if Americans are going to continue to provide her and the organization that put her in charge willingly, after they knew these things, with taxpayer funds to continue to pursue their progressive, or rather communist, agenda. For far too long, federal taxpayers have been forced to fund biased news. This needs to come to an end, and it needs to come to an end now. So I am glad Ms. Marr and Ms. Kerger accepted our invitation to show up today and be held accountable to the taxpayers. I look forward to them answering our questions in full public view and explaining to the American people why they think they deserve Americans' hard-earned taxpayer money.